What if the stories we tell ourselves about the beginning, the very first stories, didn't come from the civilizations we know? What if, before the names we recognize, before the kingdoms we've unearthed, there was something else? Something older. Something that whispered its truths into the ears of cultures separated by oceans and millennia, leaving behind not monuments or cities, but only the faintest echo in their myths? Tonight, we're going to walk together through that echo. Before we begin, if you find yourself drawn to this kind of history, the kind that lives in the margins, that sleeps between what we know and what we've forgotten, consider leaving a like, subscribing if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I'm curious to know where in the world you are as we trace these ancient whispers together. There's a peculiar comfort in history, isn't there? In knowing that civilizations rose, fell, and left their marks. We've excavated Sumeria, decoded Egypt, mapped Rome's roads and Greece's philosophy. We've built timelines, drawn neat lines connecting cause and effect, origin and descendant. We tell ourselves that we understand the arc of human story, that we've placed the pieces in their proper order. But what if we haven't? What if there's a story older than the oldest we know? A myth so ancient that it fractured, scattered, and embedded itself like shrapnel into every culture that came after. Not through conquest or trade, but through something more fundamental. Through memory itself. Across the world, separated by vast oceans and impenetrable mountain ranges, cultures with no known contact tell remarkably similar stories. Not similar in the way that humans universally fear the dark or revere the sun, but similar in their specifics, in their details, in ways that shouldn't be possible if these stories emerged independently. Consider this. In the high deserts of the American Southwest, the Hopi speak of the Sky People, beings who descended in ships of fire and taught the first humans the ways of cultivation, astronomy, and sacred geometry. They came, they taught, and then they left, promising to return when the world entered its next cycle. Now turn your attention eastward. Across an ocean the Hopi never crossed, to the ancient Sumerians. They too speak of teachers, the Apkallu, 7 wise ones who emerged from the sea before the flood, bringing civilization itself. Writing, agriculture, architecture, law. They taught, and then they vanished, leaving humanity to continue alone. Travel further east to the Vedic traditions of India, and you'll find the Saptarishi, the 7 sages, who descended from the stars to guide humanity through ages of darkness, preserving and transmitting sacred knowledge before withdrawing to the heavens. Cross the Pacific to Polynesia, and the Maori speak of the Pachapiri, the pale-skinned people of the mist who lived in the forests before the ancestors arrived, who possessed advanced knowledge and then retreated, leaving only stories. 7 teachers. Sky fire. Pre-flood wisdom. Knowledge transmitted, then withdrawn. The specifics are too precise to dismiss as coincidence, yet too separated by time and space to explain through conventional contact. We're taught to see these as independent mythologies, each culture's way of explaining the mysterious acquisition of civilization. But what if that explanation is backwards? What if these aren't independent myths trying to explain the same phenomenon, but fragments of the same story, preserved in isolation? The academic response to such patterns is typically one of 2 explanations. Either universal human psychology produces similar archetypes independently, what Jung called the collective unconscious, or there was ancient contact we simply haven't discovered yet. Both explanations are reasonable. Both are probably partly true. But neither fully accounts for the specificity of these narratives, for the precise overlap of details that shouldn't exist in cultures with no linguistic connection, no trade routes, no shared heritage that we can trace. Unless there was something before, something we've missed. Let's go deeper. Let's examine not just the stories of divine teachers, but the other motifs that repeat with unsettling consistency across these disconnected mythologies. Sky fire is one. Nearly every ancient culture has a myth about fire from the sky, not metaphorical or symbolic, but described with a specificity that suggests something observed, something remembered. The Greeks had their phaeton, losing control of the sun chariot and scorching the earth. The Norse described Ragnarok, where the sky itself would burn. Australian Aboriginal traditions speak of a time when the sky fell in flames. The Vedic texts describe the Brahmastra, a weapon of fire that could destroy entire armies and render the earth barren. These aren't gentle metaphors about lightning or volcanoes. They're descriptions of catastrophe, of fire that came from above and changed everything. Then there are the sleeping giants, the titans imprisoned beneath the earth by Zeus, the Nephilim of Hebrew tradition, mighty beings from before the flood, the Jotun of Norse mythology, ancient powers predating the gods themselves, the Quinametsin of Aztec legend, giants who built the pyramids before the current age of humanity. In nearly every corner of the world, there are stories of powerful beings from a previous age, now sleeping, imprisoned, or waiting beneath the earth or sea. Why giants? Why sleeping? Why always described as being from before? And then there's the flood. The Great Deluge appears in so many mythologies that scholars have long noted it as a universal theme. The biblical flood of Noah, the Sumerian Atrahasis, the Greek Deucalion, the Hindu Manu, the Chinese Gunyu, the Mapuche Tren Tren and Kai Kai, the Aboriginal Tadalik, the Aztec Calcayetlacu. We explain this by pointing to the end of the Ice Age, to rising sea levels that inundated coastlines where early humans lived. A shared environmental trauma producing shared mythology. Reasonable enough. Except the stories don't just describe a flood. They describe what came before the flood. They describe a world that was lost, a civilization that drowned, knowledge that was barely preserved. And they describe survivors, always a small group, who carried the memory forward, who rebuilt, who taught the next age of humanity what had been lost. What if these flood myths aren't about the flood itself, but about the cultural discontinuity the flood created? What if they're trying to tell us that something existed before, something sophisticated enough to be worth remembering, worth mourning, worth recording in the most durable medium our ancestors had? Story? Let's consider the wandering teachers more carefully. These figures appear across mythologies with remarkable consistency, and they share specific characteristics that deserve attention. First, they arrive from elsewhere, often from across the sea, sometimes from the sky, occasionally from beneath the earth. They are not native to the people they teach. They are foreigners, outsiders, strangers bearing gifts of knowledge. Second, they possess knowledge that seems impossibly advanced for the supposed era. They teach astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, architecture, writing, metallurgy, the fundamental technologies of civilization, all at once as a complete package. They don't teach one skill. They teach the entire framework of civilized life. Third, they teach and then leave. They don't stay to rule, don't establish dynasties, don't demand worship or tribute. They transfer their knowledge and withdraw, sometimes promising to return, sometimes simply vanishing. It's an oddly selfless pattern for supposedly mythological figures invented to aggrandize tribal ancestors or justify royal lineages. Fourth, and perhaps most intriguingly, they're often described as looking different from the populations they teach. The Viracocha of Inca mythology was bearded and pale-skinned. The Polynesian Pachupiri were described as fair and tall. The Egyptian Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, are depicted in pre-dynastic art as distinctly different in appearance from later Egyptians. The Sumerian Apkallu are shown in carvings as human-like but clearly other, sometimes with fish-like features, sometimes with bird-like characteristics. These descriptions are too consistent, too specific to be purely symbolic. They suggest that the people telling these stories were describing something or someone they understood to be different from themselves. Now, Orthodox archaeology would say this is simply mythological embellishment, the tendency of cultures to attribute their achievements to divine or semi-divine founders rather than to the slow, unglamorous process of gradual development. And surely that plays a role. Humans love a good origin story, prefer a dramatic founding to an incremental evolution. But consider this. What if the direction of the story is reversed? What if these myths aren't primitive peoples attributing their own achievements to gods, but sophisticated peoples trying to preserve the memory of actual teachers, actual predecessors, whose names and precise origins had already been forgotten? What if these wandering teachers were refugees, survivors of something catastrophic, carrying what remained of their culture's knowledge, moving from place to place, finding surviving communities, sharing what they knew, and then moving on or dying out, leaving only stories behind? That would explain the pattern. That would explain the specificity. That would explain why they're remembered as coming from elsewhere, looking different, possessing inexplicable knowledge, and then disappearing. It would mean these myths are historical, not in the sense that gods walked the earth, but in the sense that they're preserving a memory of real cultural transmission from a source that predates the civilizations we recognize. And if that's true, then we should find evidence beyond mythology. We should find cultural artifacts, linguistic remnants, archaeological anomalies that don't fit neatly into our established timelines. And we do. Let's talk about Göbekli Tepe. You may have heard of it. It's become something of a sensation in alternative history circles, and for good reason. It's a megalithic temple complex in southeastern Turkey, constructed with massive T-shaped pillars carved with intricate reliefs of animals, abstract symbols, and humanoid figures. The stunning part isn't the sophistication of the carvings or the engineering required to move and erect stones weighing up to 16 tons each. The stunning part is the date, 9,600 BCE, nearly 12,000 years ago, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the pyramids, 2,000 years before agriculture was supposed to have been invented in that region. According to our established timeline, the people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. They had no cities, no writing, no social complexity beyond small tribal bands. They were, in the narrative we've constructed, at the very beginning of the long road toward civilization. And yet they organized labor forces, developed sophisticated stoneworking techniques, created complex symbolic art, and built a monumental structure that served no apparent practical purpose. It wasn't a dwelling, wasn't a granary, wasn't a defensive structure. It was, as far as we can tell, purely ceremonial, purely symbolic. A temple built by people who supposedly didn't have religion complex enough to need temples. The archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who excavated Göbekli Tepe, suggested that the site challenges our fundamental assumptions about the origins of civilization. Perhaps religion came before agriculture, he argued. Perhaps the need to gather for ritual purposes drove the development of food production, rather than the other way around. But there's another possibility, one that the wandering teacher myths suggest. What if the builders of Göbekli Tepe weren't at the beginning of the civilizational process but at the end of one? What if they were survivors, building one last monument to what had been lost, encoding their knowledge in stone before the memory faded entirely? Look at the symbolism carved into those pillars. Foxes, scorpions, snakes, birds, lions, bulls. Wild animals, certainly, but arranged in ways that suggest meaning beyond mere decoration. Some researchers have proposed that the carvings represent constellations, that Göbekli Tepe was an astronomical observatory or calendar encoded in stone. And then, around 8000 BCE, the site was deliberately buried. Not abandoned, not destroyed by enemies or catastrophe. Carefully, intentionally filled in with debris, preserved beneath the earth. Why would anyone go to such effort to bury a temple they'd spent generations building? Unless it was meant to be found later. Unless it was a time capsule, a message to the future, a way of saying, we were here, we knew things, we built this so you would remember. Göbekli Tepe isn't unique. It's part of a broader pattern of anomalous structures that predate the civilizations we credit with inventing monumental architecture. In Peru, the Caral Soup civilization built pyramids, plazas, and amphitheaters around 3000 BCE, contemporary with the Egyptian Old Kingdom but completely independent, developing in total isolation on the other side of the world. They had sophisticated urban planning, complex social structures, and no pottery, no art, no weapons of war. A peaceful, organized society that appeared seemingly fully formed and then vanished, leaving only stones. On Malta, the megalithic temples of Gantija, Hagar Kim, and Najdr date to 3600 BCE, built by a Neolithic people we know almost nothing about. The temples are architecturally sophisticated, with corbelled roofs, precisely fitted stones, and acoustic properties that suggest they were designed for ritual sound. The people who built them left no writing, no clear successors, no explanation for where their architectural knowledge came from or where it went. In Egypt itself, before the pyramids we know, there are structures that don't fit the standard chronology. The Osirian at Abydos, conventionally dated to the New Kingdom, is built in a style that resembles Old Kingdom work but uses massive megalithic blocks more reminiscent of pre-dynastic or even pre-Egyptian construction. Some researchers have suggested it's far older than officially recognized, a remnant of something that came before. And then there are the structures that don't fit any chronology at all. The underwater ruins off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, which, if they are artificial as some claim, would have been built when the site was above water at least 10,000 years ago. The stone spheres of Costa Rica, hundreds of them, ranging from a few centimeters to over 2 meters in diameter, carved with such precision that they're nearly perfect spheres, created by a pre-Columbian culture we know almost nothing about. The submerged structures in the Gulf of Khumbat off the coast of India, which, if the preliminary dating is correct, could be 9,000 years old. Each of these can be explained away individually. Yonaguni might be natural rock formations that look artificial. The Costa Rican spheres might be later than we think. The Gulf of Khumbat structures might be misidentified geological features. Mainstream archaeology has explanations, caveats, reasons to doubt. But taken together, they suggest something orthodox archaeology resists: that there was more sophistication, more organization, more knowledge in the deep past than our models allow for. And if there was more sophistication than we've acknowledged, then the myths about teachers, about lost knowledge, about a civilization before the civilizations we know, those myths start to sound less like fantasy and more like memory. Let's turn to language, because this is where the pattern becomes even stranger. Linguists have reconstructed proto-languages by comparing modern languages and working backwards, identifying common roots and structures that reveal ancestral tongues. Proto-Indo-European is the most famous, the reconstructed ancestor of languages from Hindi to English, from Greek to Gaelic. It's a triumph of linguistic detective work, allowing us to trace language families back thousands of years. But there are words, scattered across unrelated language families, that seem to share roots with no clear explanation. Words for fundamental concepts, water, fire, mother, mountain, that appear in forms too similar to be coincidental yet too separated to be explained by contact or common ancestry. Some linguists have proposed deeper proto-languages, ancestral tongues that predate even Proto-Indo-European, that might have been spoken by a hypothetical predispersal human population. Others have looked for substrate languages, linguistic remnants of populations that existed before the arrival of later groups, whose words survived even as their people vanished or assimilated. And then there are the isolates, languages with no known relatives, that appear fully formed with no clear lineage. Basque in Europe, Ainu in Japan, Sumerian in Mesopotamia, Burushaski in Pakistan. Languages that defy categorization, that resist connection to any language family, that stand alone. Why should such languages exist? If human language evolved gradually, spreading and diversifying as populations migrated, we'd expect to be able to trace every language back to some ancestral form. Isolates suggest something else. Either populations so ancient or so isolated that their linguistic ancestors vanished completely, or, and this is the unsettling possibility, language traditions preserved from something older, from a time before the linguistic families we've reconstructed. There's a story told among the San people of southern Africa, one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, with a lineage stretching back perhaps 100,000 years. They speak of the first people, not the San themselves, but another group who lived before them, who walked the same lands and then vanished, leaving only stories and strange paintings on rock faces deep in the Drakensberg Mountains. Those paintings depict scenes that don't match San culture. Figures in elaborate dress, symbols and geometric patterns that resemble nothing in San tradition. Scenes of what appear to be large organized ceremonies or gatherings. The San say these paintings aren't theirs, that they were already ancient when their ancestors arrived, made by people whose name has been forgotten. In Aboriginal Australian traditions, there are stories of people who came before, who lived during the Dreamtime but weren't the ancestors proper. These earlier people are described as having different laws, different practices, and they vanished or transformed when the world changed into its current form. The stories are vague, metaphorical, but they preserve the idea of a previous human presence, something before the culture that exists now. In the Amazon, among tribes only recently contacted, there are oral traditions about the cloud people, pale-skinned, tall, who lived in the forest before the current inhabitants. They're described as builders, as knowledgeable in plants and stars, and as having left or died out long ago. These traditions don't refer to European contact. They predate it, recorded by early explorers before significant colonial presence. These are oral histories from cultures with no contact with each other, separated by oceans and continents, yet they preserve remarkably similar concepts. There were people before us, they had knowledge, they vanished, and we came after. We're trained to dismiss such stories as mythological genealogy, the common human impulse to claim descent from special ancestors. But what if the impulse comes from the other direction? What if these stories persist because they're true, because there was something before, and the memory of it has survived in the only medium available to preliterate cultures, oral tradition? Consider how durable oral traditions can be. Aboriginal Australian songlines preserve geographic and environmental information across tens of thousands of years. The stories encode practical knowledge, where water can be found, where dangers lie, how to navigate vast distances. But they also preserve historical information. Some songlines describe landscapes that only existed before sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, meaning they've been passed down accurately for over 10,000 years. If oral traditions can preserve geographical information for 10 millennia, they can preserve historical information too. They can preserve the memory of who came before. And if we take these traditions seriously, if we accept that they might be preserving real historical memory, then we have to ask, who were these first people? Where did they come from? What happened to them? The myths themselves offer clues. Remember the consistent themes: sky fire, flood, catastrophe. Something happened. Something global or near global in scope. Something that destroyed a previous age and required the survivors to rebuild. The end of the last ice age fits that description. Between roughly 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, the Earth experienced the Younger Dryas, a period of rapid climate fluctuation. Temperatures plummeted suddenly, glaciers advanced, and then, just as abruptly, the world warmed again. Ice sheets collapsed, sea levels rose by hundreds of feet, coastlines vanished beneath the waves. If there were human civilizations living on those coastlines, and that's where humans have always concentrated, where resources are abundant and trade is possible, those civilizations would have been inundated, drowned, erased. The survivors would have fled inland, carrying what they could of their knowledge, becoming refugees in a transformed world. Graham Hancock has popularized this idea, proposing that an advanced Ice Age civilization was destroyed by the cataclysms of the Younger Dryas, and that the survivors became the wandering teachers of myth, spreading their knowledge to the hunter-gatherer populations they encountered. Mainstream archaeology largely rejects this, pointing to the lack of physical evidence for such a civilization. No ruins, no artifacts, no unambiguous traces of advanced culture from that period. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when we're talking about coastlines that are now underwater, about organic materials that don't preserve, about a time period we've barely explored archaeologically. And there is evidence, just not the kind we're conditioned to expect. The evidence is in the myths themselves, in the linguistic anomalies, in the structures that don't fit our timelines, in the oral traditions that speak of people before. It's in the genetic evidence too. Studies of human DNA have revealed something curious. A genetic bottleneck around 70,000 years ago, the Toba bottleneck, when human population crashed to perhaps 10,000 individuals total. But there are other, smaller genetic signatures, population fluctuations, and admixtures that don't quite fit our models of human migration and expansion. There's evidence of ghost populations, groups that contributed DNA to modern humans but for whom we have no archaeological trace, no physical remains, no cultural artifacts. They existed, they interbred with our ancestors, and then they vanished, leaving only genetic echoes. What if some of these ghost populations weren't contemporary with the humans they mixed with, but were remnants of an older dispersal, survivors of an earlier era who were absorbed into later populations? What if the first people of myth are these ghost populations, groups sophisticated enough to develop proto-civilizations during favorable climatic periods of the Ice Age, only to be nearly wiped out by the Younger Dryas cataclysm, their survivors scattering, mixing, and eventually vanishing as distinct populations? It would explain the myths. It would explain the anomalous structures. It would explain the linguistic isolates and the substrate words. It would explain why cultures across the world tell similar stories of teachers and lost ages. Because they're all remembering the same event, the same people from different angles. Let's examine one more pattern, perhaps the most intriguing. The encoded knowledge in ancient myths, information that the cultures telling the stories shouldn't have possessed. Take the Dogon people of Mali. In the 1930s and 40s, anthropologists studying Dogon cosmology were told that Sirius, the brightest star in our sky, has a companion star, Sirius B, that's invisible to the naked eye, that orbits Sirius every 50 years, and that's incredibly dense, the heaviest star. This is accurate. Sirius B is a white dwarf, invisible without a telescope, with an orbital period of about 50 years, and it is indeed extraordinarily dense. A teaspoon of its matter would weigh tons on Earth. The Dogon shouldn't have known this. White dwarfs weren't discovered until 1862, and Sirius B specifically wasn't observed until 1862 and not photographed until 1970. The Dogon claimed this knowledge came from their ancestors, from the Namo, amphibious beings who came from the Sirius system long ago to teach humanity. Orthodox anthropology suggests the Dogon learned about Sirius B from Western visitors in the early 20th century and incorporated it into their existing mythology. It's a reasonable explanation, though the Dogon themselves insisted their knowledge was ancient, passed down through initiatory teachings. Whether the Dogon truly possessed ancient knowledge of Sirius B or not, the case illustrates a broader point. Ancient myths sometimes contain accurate astronomical information that the cultures telling them shouldn't have been able to observe or calculate. The Mayan long count calendar, for instance, tracks cycles of time with extraordinary precision, including the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle of roughly 26,000 years caused by the wobble of Earth's axis. Calculating precession requires centuries of careful astronomical observation. How did a culture that flourished for only a few centuries possess knowledge of a cycle that takes 26,000 years to complete? The orthodox answer is that they inherited it from earlier Mesoamerican cultures, extrapolated from longer observation periods. But that just pushes the question back. Where did those earlier cultures get it? The ancient Egyptians oriented the pyramids of Giza with extraordinary precision to true north, achieving an accuracy of 1/15 of a degree. They encoded in the dimensions of the Great Pyramid mathematical constants like pi and phi. They depicted in the dendrozodiac astronomical configurations that, if taken literally, would date the carving to 10,500 BCE, though the temple itself is from the Ptolemaic period. The Sumerians used a sexagesimal base 60 mathematical system, which is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Base 60 is actually superior to base 10 for certain calculations because 60 is highly composite, divisible by many factors. But why would an early civilization choose such an unintuitive system unless they inherited it from predecessors who had already worked out its advantages? The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a shipwreck off Greece and dating to around 100 BCE, is a sophisticated astronomical calculator with dozens of interlocking gears, capable of predicting eclipses, tracking the moon's irregular orbit, and modeling the motions of the planets. It's so complex that nothing comparable appears in the historical record for another 1,000 years. How did ancient Greeks build something that advanced? The assumption is that the knowledge existed but most examples didn't survive, that the Antikythera mechanism represents a lost tradition of Hellenistic engineering. But again, we're explaining an anomaly by hypothesizing. Lost knowledge, exactly what the myths about wandering teachers suggest. These aren't proof of ancient astronauts or Atlantean superscience. They're something subtler. Evidence that ancient peoples possessed knowledge and capabilities that our narratives of linear progress from primitive to advanced don't fully account for. They're evidence that knowledge was lost, preserved, lost again, partially recovered. That the story of human civilization isn't a straight line from ignorance to enlightenment, but a cycle of amnesia and remembrance. And if knowledge was lost and recovered, then there must have been something to lose. Some body of understanding, some corpus of wisdom that existed before the civilizations we know, was damaged or destroyed, and was partially preserved in the myths and monuments of successor cultures. The wandering teachers, then, would be the human vectors of that preservation, the survivors carrying fragments of the old knowledge, teaching what they remembered to the communities they found, and embedding their stories in myth so that even when the specific details were forgotten, the fact of their existence, the fact that there had been something before, would survive. Let's consider one final category of evidence: the unclassifiable artifacts. These are objects that archaeologists have found but struggle to fit into established cultural contexts. They're too sophisticated for their attributed date, or they appear in places they shouldn't, or they employ techniques that weren't supposed to exist yet. The Baghdad battery, for instance, a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, found in Iraq and dating to the Parthian period, around 200 CE. When filled with an acidic liquid, it generates a small electrical current. Was it actually a battery? So what was it used for? The conventional explanation is that it was for electroplating gold onto silver, though we have no evidence the Parthians did electroplating. The alternative, that it's a much older technology repurposed or preserved, isn't seriously considered, but it would fit the pattern of inherited knowledge. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, shows the coastline of Antarctica, except it shows the coastline as it would appear without ice, with mountains and rivers that are indeed there but have been under kilometers of ice for millions of years. How could a 16th-century Ottoman cartographer have mapped ice-free Antarctica? The map itself states it was compiled from older sources, some dating to the time of Alexander the Great or before. If those sources were accurate, they must have been based on observations made when Antarctica was ice-free, which would place them impossibly far back in time, unless there were sophisticated maritime cultures exploring and mapping the world long before our accepted chronologies allow. The Dropa stones, allegedly found in China in 1938, are said to be 12,000-year-old granite discs inscribed with tiny hieroglyphs telling the story of a spacecraft crash and survivors who couldn't return home. The stones themselves have never been properly verified, and most researchers consider them a hoax. But the story persists because it fits the template: ancient artifact, anomalous content, story of visitors from elsewhere. Whether any specific artifact is genuine or correctly interpreted is almost beside the point. What matters is the pattern, the recurring discovery of things that don't fit, that suggest greater complexity than we've accounted for. And the response to these anomalies is revealing. Mainstream archaeology tends toward conservative interpretation, preferring explanations that fit existing frameworks. That's good science. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and we shouldn't overturn established models based on ambiguous finds. But there's a difference between healthy skepticism and reflexive dismissal. When every anomaly is explained away, when every myth is reduced to allegory, when every out-of-place artifact is either misdated, misidentified, or declared a hoax, we risk missing a larger truth. We risk missing the signal in the noise, because the signal is there. It's in the myths that repeat across cultures. It's in the oral traditions that speak of first people. It's in the monuments that predate civilization as we understand it. It's in the genetic ghosts and linguistic isolates. It's in the encoded astronomical knowledge and the unclassifiable artifacts. Individually, each piece of evidence is ambiguous, explicable, dismissible. But collectively, they form a pattern. And that pattern suggests a narrative we've been reluctant to accept. That human history extends further back into sophistication than we've acknowledged. That there were cultures, perhaps not global civilizations in the modern sense, but organized, knowledgeable, sophisticated societies that existed before the ones we've named and studied, and that those societies were destroyed or disrupted by catastrophes, leaving only fragments, only echoes, only stories. The myths aren't just trying to explain the world. They're trying to remember it. So where does this leave us? What do we do with this pattern of evidence and myth? We could dismiss it. We could say that the similarities in myths are coincidental, that oral traditions are unreliable, that anomalous artifacts are misinterpreted or fraudulent, that the monuments are impressive but explainable within conventional frameworks. Or we could sit with the uncertainty. We could acknowledge that we don't know everything about the deep past, that our picture is incomplete, that there might be chapters of human story we've missed entirely because we weren't looking in the right places or asking the right questions. We could accept that the myths might be telling us something true, not literally, probably not literally, but essentially. That there were people before, that they knew things, that they were lost, and that we've been trying to recover what they knew ever since. Think about how this reframes human history. Instead of a narrative of linear progress from primitive to advanced, It becomes a narrative of cycles of rise and fall and rise again. Civilizations emerge, accumulate knowledge, face catastrophes, collapse. Survivors scatter, carrying what they can. New cultures arise, building on fragments of the old, often unaware of how much they're rediscovering rather than inventing. We see ourselves as the first, the most advanced, the pinnacle of a long climb from ignorance. But what if we're not the first? What if we're the latest in a series, the newest version of something humanity has done before, perhaps many times? It's a humbling thought, and perhaps that's why we resist it. We want to believe in our uniqueness, our exceptionalism, our unprecedented achievement. We want to be the first civilization, the inventors of writing and cities and science and art. But if the myths are memory, then we're not inventors. We're remembers. We're recovering something that was known before, piecing together a puzzle whose complete picture was shattered long ago. And if that's true, then the purpose of archaeology, of anthropology, of history itself changes. It's not just about cataloging the past. It's about recovering what was lost. It's about listening to the myths, not as quaint stories, but as testimony. It's about recognizing that the ancients were trying to tell us something across the millennia, and we haven't been listening carefully enough. The wandering teachers in the myths, the Apkallu, the Viracocha, the Shemsuhor, the Sky People, they weren't gods. They were human or human enough. They were survivors of something, carriers of knowledge from before the flood, before the catastrophe, before the world changed. They taught what they remembered, and then they died or moved on, and the cultures they taught transformed those teachers into legends, into myths, into gods. But underneath the mythological embellishment, there's a historical core. Real people, real knowledge transfer, real cultural continuity from something older. And if we can look past the supernatural trappings, if we can read the myths as distorted history rather than pure fiction, then we can start to reconstruct what came before. We can start to identify the patterns in the stories, correlate them with archaeological anomalies, with genetic data, with linguistic substrates, with climatic events, and build a picture, incomplete, speculative, uncertain, but increasingly coherent, of what the world looked like before the civilizations we know. That picture would show us coastal cultures, maritime peoples, living on land that's now underwater, developing sophisticated knowledge of astronomy and navigation and agriculture during favorable climatic periods of the Ice Age. It would show us a world of scattered populations, some more advanced than others, trading ideas and goods across surprisingly long distances. And then it would show us catastrophe. Whether it was the Younger Dryas, whether it was impacts from cometary debris, whether it was volcanic eruptions or solar storms or some combination of all of these, something happened around 12,000 years ago that destroyed that world. Sea levels rose, coastlines drowned, populations crashed, knowledge was lost. But not all of it. Some survived. Some people survived. And those survivors became the teachers, the wanderers, the mysterious figures of myth who appear at the beginning of every civilization we know, teaching and then vanishing. They gave the Sumerians their sudden sophistication. They taught the Egyptians their astronomy. They brought agriculture to multiple regions simultaneously. They built Göbekli Tepe as a marker, as a message, as proof that they existed. And then they were absorbed, died out, vanished into the populations they taught, leaving only their knowledge and their stories behind. We are their descendants, not just genetically but culturally. The knowledge we have, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, architecture, we didn't invent it from scratch. We recovered it. We remembered it. We're still remembering it. And the myths are the instruction manual. They're the map. They're the breadcrumb trail leading back to what was before. So what's the oldest myth? What's the original story, the first narrative that all the others are fragments of? It might be something like this. There was a world before this one. It was not like our world. The land was different, the sea was lower, the climate was colder. But it was inhabited. People lived there, scattered and diverse, and some of them grew sophisticated. They learned to read the stars, to plant seeds, to work stone and metal, to organize themselves into communities. And then the world changed. Fire fell from the sky, or the ice melted, or the earth shook. Something catastrophic, something global. The old world drowned. Most of the people died. The knowledge they had accumulated was lost, except for what a few survivors carried in their memories. Those survivors wandered. They found other groups, people who had lived through the catastrophe but had never developed the same level of knowledge. And the survivors taught them. They shared what they remembered of the old ways, the old knowledge. They became teachers, guides, culture bringers. And the people they taught remembered them as different, as other, as possessing wisdom that seemed supernatural. They turned the teachers into myths, into gods, into legends. But underneath the legend there was history. That's the original story. That's what the myths across the world are trying to tell us. Each in their own cultural language, each with their own symbolic additions, but all preserving the same essential narrative. There were people before. They knew things. Catastrophe destroyed their world. Survivors taught us, and we carry their legacy. If this is true, and I'm not claiming certainty, only possibility, only pattern, then it changes how we should think about the deep past. It means we should be looking underwater on the continental shelves for the ruins of the coastal cultures that drowned when the Ice Age ended. We should be taking the flood myths seriously as historical testimony, using them to guide archaeological exploration. It means we should be re-examining anomalous artifacts and structures, not with credulity but with openness, willing to consider that they might be older or more sophisticated than conventional dating suggests. It means we should be listening more carefully to oral traditions, especially from the oldest continuous cultures, the Aboriginal Australians, the San, the Andamanese, the groups that have maintained their cultural memory for tens of thousands of years. They might be preserving stories from the time before, stories that we've dismissed as mythology but which contain historical truth. It means we should be integrating disciplines, archaeology, genetics, linguistics, climatology, mythology, to build a more complete picture, rather than keeping each in its own silo. And it means we should be humble. Humble about what we know and don't know. Humble about our place in the long arc of human story. Humble about the possibility that others came before us, achieved things we're only now recovering, and were erased so thoroughly that only their myths remain. There's a melancholy beauty in that, isn't there? The idea that everything we're so proud of, our science, our cities, our knowledge, might be remembered rather than invented. That we're walking a path others walked before, following footsteps we can barely discern, rebuilding what was lost. It doesn't diminish our achievements. If anything, it makes them more poignant. We're not just building civilization, we're rebuilding it. We're not just discovering truth. We're rediscovering it. We're completing a cycle, closing a loop, recovering a heritage we didn't know we'd lost. And the myths are the thread connecting us to that lost heritage. They're the voice of the ancestors, not our immediate ancestors but the deeper ones, the first people calling to us across the abyss of time, saying, "We were here, we knew, we survived, we taught, remember us." So perhaps the world's oldest myth doesn't come from a single culture we can name. Perhaps it comes from a culture that existed before the cultures we know. A culture that was destroyed so thoroughly that only its echoes remain, refracted through 100 different traditions, 1,000 different stories, all telling the same essential tale in different words. The myth of the teachers, the myth of the flood, the myth of the lost age, the myth of knowledge from before. It's not a Sumerian myth or an Aboriginal myth or a Mayan myth. It's a human myth older than any civilization we've named, preserved in pieces across the world, waiting for us to reassemble it, to remember it, to understand what it's trying to tell us. That we've been here before, that we've risen before, that we've fallen before, and that we carry within us, in our stories and our symbols and our fragmentary memories, the knowledge of all that came before. The giants sleeping beneath the earth aren't metaphors for natural forces. They're memories of predecessors, of a previous humanity, buried by time and catastrophe, waiting to be rediscovered. Not literally, perhaps, but culturally, historically. The knowledge they had is sleeping too, buried in the myths, encoded in the monuments, scattered across the world in fragments. And we're the ones waking it up. Every time we excavate a new site that pushes back the dates of civilization, we're waking the giants. Every time we decode an ancient language or map an underwater ruin or trace a genetic lineage back further than we thought possible, we're waking them. Every time we take a myth seriously as potential history rather than dismissing it as primitive superstition, we're waking them. The process is slow. It's frustrating. The evidence is fragmentary, ambiguous, often contradictory. But the pattern is there, and it's becoming clearer. There were people before. They built. They knew. They were lost. Their students survived and became the founders of the civilizations we recognize. And the first thing those civilizations did, the first stories they told, were about the teachers who came before, the knowledge that was gifted to them, the lost age they were trying to recover. Every creation myth that begins with chaos and then the arrival of order, the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the Greek Theogony, the Norse creation from Ginnungagap, the Vedic hymns of creation, they're not describing the absolute beginning. They're describing the beginning after the end. They're describing the emergence of the current age from the ruins of the previous one. The chaos isn't primordial. It's post-catastrophic. It's the world after the flood, after the fire, after the destruction. And the gods who bring order aren't creating from nothing. They're restoring, rebuilding, remembering. When the Babylonian god Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the world from her body, he's not making something new. He's making something again. The myth even says he consults the Tablet of Destinies, implying pre-existing knowledge, a plan from before. When the Norse Odin and his brothers slay the giant Ymir and create the world from his flesh, they're building the current world from the remains of an older one. The giants came first. The gods came after. The world we live in is built on the corpse of what came before. These aren't just poetic images. They're historical memories, distorted by time and retelling, but preserving the essential truth. The world we know was built on the ruins of something older. And if we accept that, even provisionally, even as a working hypothesis, then we have to ask, what else are the myths trying to tell us? What about the sky fire? Every culture has a myth about fire from the heavens, destruction from above. We've explained it as volcano myths, as lightning myths, as metaphors for divine wrath. But what if it's more specific than that? Around 12,800 years ago, at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, there's evidence in the geological record of widespread fires across North America, extinction of megafauna, a layer of nanodiamonds and other materials consistent with extraterrestrial impact. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that a comet or asteroid, likely fragmenting in the atmosphere, struck the North American ice sheet, causing rapid melting, climate disruption, and widespread devastation. The hypothesis is controversial. Many geologists dispute it, arguing the evidence is inconclusive. But whether it was an impact or some other catastrophic event, something happened at that boundary. The climate changed suddenly. The ice melted rapidly. Sea levels rose. And if there were human cultures living along those now-drowned coastlines, they would have experienced it as apocalypse. Fire from the sky, floods, the end of the world, and they would have told their children about it. And their children would have told their children. And 10,000 years later, we'd have myths about sky fire and floods, preserved in every culture descended from the survivors. The myths aren't symbolic. They're testimonial. What about the serpent? The dragon? Present in mythologies worldwide, the rainbow serpent of Aboriginal Australia, the Naga of India, Quetzalcoatl of Mesoamerica, the dragons of China and Europe, Jormungandr of Norse myth, Tiamat of Babylon. Often associated with water, with wisdom, with creation and destruction, with chaos and order. Carl Jung interpreted the serpent as a psychological archetype, a symbol of the unconscious, transformation, and primal fear. Joseph Campbell saw it as a universal symbol of the life force, the cycle of death and rebirth. But what if it's also a memory? What if the serpent represents something specific, perhaps a celestial phenomenon, a comet with its characteristic sinuous tail, streaking across ancient skies? Comets were called long-tailed stars in many cultures. A fragmenting comet, pieces burning through the atmosphere, could appear serpent-like, dragon-like, a creature of fire in the sky. If the Younger Dryas was indeed caused by cometary impact, then the survivors would have seen it. They would have seen the sky serpent, the dragon of fire, and they would have remembered it, encoded it in their myths as the primordial serpent, the chaos dragon, the beast that had to be defeated before the world could be made safe. Again, I'm speculating, connecting dots that might not connect. But the patterns are suggestive. The myths recur with too much consistency, too much specificity, to be purely archetypal or coincidental. They're trying to tell us something about what happened, about what was lost, about what came before. Let's talk about the number 7. It appears repeatedly in ancient myths and sacred traditions with peculiar insistence. 7 sages, 7 heavens, 7 days of creation, 7 planets of ancient astronomy, 7 musical notes in the diatonic scale, 7 chakras, 7 virtues, 7 sins. Why 7? The standard answer is that 7 is a small enough number to be memorable but large enough to feel significant, and that humans have a psychological preference for it. There were 7 visible celestial bodies in ancient astronomy: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. So 7 became sacred. But what if the number 7 in mythology also encodes something more specific? The 7 sages, the 7 teachers appearing in Sumerian, Vedic, and other traditions, what if they're not symbolic but historical? What if there actually were 7 individuals or 7 groups who carried knowledge from the previous age, who scattered across the world after the catastrophe, teaching what they remembered? 7 is a manageable number for a refugee population. 7 communities, 7 ships, 7 groups of survivors dividing to cover more ground, to ensure that if one group failed, others might succeed. It's a strategy that makes sense in the face of catastrophe. Divide resources, spread risk, maximize the chance that the knowledge will survive somewhere. And if those 7 groups or individuals became the founders of different post-catastrophe cultures, each would preserve the story slightly differently, but the core number 7 would remain consistent, a fossil record of the original division. I'm weaving a narrative now, constructing a possibility from fragments. I don't have proof. No one does. But the exercise itself is valuable because it forces us to take the myths seriously, to ask what they might be telling us if we read them as distorted history rather than pure invention. And when we do that, when we take the storytellers at their word that they're recounting something that actually happened, just explaining it in the symbolic language available to them, the picture that emerges is remarkably consistent. There was a world before, more sophisticated than we've credited. Catastrophe destroyed it. Survivors carried the knowledge forward. They taught the people they encountered. Those people turned the teachers into legends and spent the next 10,000 years trying to recover what was lost. That's the master narrative beneath all the individual myths. That's the story that cultures across the world have been telling, each in their own way, since the dawn of recorded history. And it's a story that's still unfolding. We're still in the process of recovery. We're still waking the sleeping giants, still reassembling the fragments, still decoding the messages left for us in stone and story. Consider how much we've rediscovered in just the last few centuries. We decoded cuneiform, hieroglyphics, linear B, languages that had been forgotten for millennia. We excavated cities that were only myths: Troy, Pompeii, Angkor Wat. We developed technologies that ancient peoples described but couldn't build. Flying machines, instant communication across distances, artificial intelligence. We're not inventing these things from whole cloth. We're recovering them, following a blueprint that was sketched thousands of years ago. The myths describe flying chariots, divine messengers who communicate instantly across the world, mechanical servants who answer questions. We call them vimanas, we call them angels, we call them golems, and then we build airplanes and telephones and computers and act surprised that the ancients imagined them first. But they weren't imagining. They were remembering. They were describing what the first people had, or what the survivors told them the first people had before it was lost. And now we're building it again, completing the cycle, becoming the people the myths described. It's a strange feeling, isn't it? To realize that the future we're building might be the past we've forgotten. That progress might be circular rather than linear. That we're not moving forward into unprecedented territory, but retracing a path that's been walked before. Some find this idea unsettling, even threatening. It challenges our sense of uniqueness, our belief in human progress, our confidence that we're the pinnacle of civilization. If we're just recovering what others achieved before us, what does that say about our accomplishments? But I think it's profoundly hopeful. It means that even after catastrophe, even after nearly total destruction, humanity persists. Knowledge persists. Culture persists. Not intact, not unchanged, but in fragments, in echoes, in the stories we tell and the things we build. It means that what we're doing now matters. We're not just living our individual lives. We're part of a much longer story, a story that spans tens of thousands of years, a story of loss and recovery, of forgetting and remembering, of cycles that turn and return. And it means that the myths matter. They're not just entertainment or primitive science. They're our inheritance, our link to the past, our guide to what came before. Every time we dismiss a myth as superstition, every time we ignore an oral tradition as unreliable, we're severing that link, cutting ourselves off from our own deeper history. We should be collecting myths, preserving oral traditions, taking the stories of indigenous peoples seriously as historical testimony, because they're the keepers of memory that goes back further than our written records, further than our archaeology, back to the time before. The Aboriginal Australians have maintained their culture for 65,000 years or more, the longest continuous culture on Earth. Their songlines encode the landscape, but they also encode history, events that happened tens of thousands of years ago, preserved with remarkable accuracy. If we dismiss their stories as mythology without examining them for historical content, we're throwing away potentially the longest historical record humanity possesses. The same is true for the San, whose genetic lineage traces back over 100,000 years, who preserve stories of previous peoples, of times when the world was different. The same for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, whose oral traditions describe migrations, catastrophes, encounters with other groups, all before European contact, all potentially preserving information about the deep past. These aren't primitive peoples telling primitive stories. They're the survivors of survivors of survivors, maintaining cultural memories across unimaginable spans of time, and their stories might be the clearest window we have into what happened before the civilizations we know emerged. So what do we do with this? How do we move forward, knowing that the past is more complex and mysterious than we've been taught, that the myths might be true in ways we haven't understood, that there might be a lost chapter of human story waiting to be recovered? First, we stay curious. We resist the temptation to settle into comfortable certainties, to declare the question answered. The more we learn about the deep past, the more questions arise, and that's good. That's what inquiry is supposed to be, an ongoing process of discovery, not a destination. Second, we stay humble. We acknowledge the limits of our knowledge. We recognize that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when we're dealing with timescales of 10,000 years or more, when coastlines have drowned, when organic materials have decayed, when entire landscapes have transformed. The fact that we haven't found physical remains of a pre-Younger Dryas civilization doesn't mean it didn't exist. It means we need to keep looking or look in different ways. Third, we stay open. We listen to the myths, to the oral traditions, to the stories that have survived longer than any written record. We take them seriously as potential history, examining them for core truths beneath the symbolic elaboration. We look for patterns, for consistencies across cultures, for details that shouldn't be there if the stories were pure invention. Fourth, we integrate. We bring together different disciplines: archaeology, genetics, linguistics, climatology, astronomy, mythology, and look for convergences, for places where different lines of evidence point to the same conclusion. The truth, if we can approach it, will be consistent across domains. The myths and the monuments and the DNA and the geological record should all tell the same story, once we learn how to read them properly. And fifth, we imagine. We allow ourselves to construct narratives, to speculate, to envision what the lost world might have looked like, who the first people might have been, what they achieved and how they lived and why they were forgotten. Not as definitive truth, but as working hypotheses, as stories we tell ourselves to organize the fragmentary evidence, as frameworks for further investigation. Because in the end, that's what history is. A story we tell about the past, constructed from incomplete evidence, always provisional, always open to revision. The difference between good history and bad history isn't that good history is certain. It's that good history acknowledges its uncertainty, recognizes its gaps, and remains open to new evidence. And the story of the first people, the lost civilization, the pre-catastrophe world that the myths preserve, that's a good story. It fits the evidence we have. It explains the anomalies. It makes sense of the patterns in mythology. It honors the testimony of oral traditions. And it leaves room for discovery, for new evidence, for revision and refinement. It's a story that says, humanity is older, stranger, and more resilient than we thought. We've been through this before. We've risen before. We've fallen before. And we've carried the memory forward, in our myths and our monuments and our deepest cultural instincts, waiting for the day when we'd be ready to remember fully, to recover what was lost, to complete the cycle. That day might be now. We have the tools, archaeological, genetic, computational, analytical, to investigate the deep past in ways that were impossible even a generation ago. We can date organic materials with precision, map underwater landscapes, analyze DNA from ancient remains, decode lost languages with AI, correlate climate data with cultural transitions. We can, if we choose, test the hypothesis that the myths preserve. We can search the submerged continental shelves for evidence of coastal cultures. We can look for genetic signatures of population bottlenecks and admixtures that match the catastrophe timeline. We can map linguistic substrates that predate known language families. We can re-examine anomalous artifacts and structures with fresh eyes, willing to consider that they might be telling us something our models haven't accounted for. And if we find evidence, if we discover ruins on the seafloor that predate Sumeria and Egypt, if we identify genetic markers that confirm the existence of ghost populations with sophisticated cultures, if we decode symbols that reveal transmitted knowledge from an earlier age, then we'll have confirmed what the myths have been telling us all along. That there were people before, that they knew, that we are their children, their students, their inheritors, that everything we built on their foundation, that we're not the first, but we might be the first to fully remember. And if we don't find that evidence, if the search turns up nothing definitive, if the myths remain ambiguous, if the anomalies have other explanations, then we'll still have asked the question. We'll still have taken seriously the possibility that there's more to human history than we've been taught. We'll still have listened to the storytellers, honored the oral traditions, looked for the deeper patterns. And that, in itself, is valuable, because the question changes how we see ourselves. It makes us aware that we stand on a foundation we didn't build, that we carry knowledge we didn't originate, that we're part of a story much longer than our individual or civilizational lifespans. It makes us custodians rather than originators. It makes us responsible for preserving what we've recovered, for passing it forward, for ensuring that if catastrophe comes again, and it always might, something survives, some fragment of knowledge, some seed of culture that can regenerate in the aftermath. That's what the first people did, if they existed. They preserved, they taught, they embedded their knowledge in the cultures they found, in the monuments they built, in the stories they told. They made sure that even though their world was ending, something of it would survive. And now it's our turn. We're the civilization now. We're the ones with the knowledge, the technology, the reach. And if history is cyclical, if catastrophe is a recurring feature of the human experience rather than a distant past event, then we have a responsibility to do what the first people did: preserve, teach, embed. We need to create our own monuments, our own time capsules, our own mechanisms for transmitting knowledge across potential civilizational collapse. We need to ensure that if we fall, what comes after will have something to build on, some foundation to recover from. That's the real lesson of the myths, I think. Not that there were literally gods who walked the earth, not that ancient astronauts gave us civilization, not any of the sensational interpretations that grab headlines. The lesson is simpler and more profound. Knowledge is fragile, civilization is fragile, but human memory and human resilience are stronger than we imagine. Even after catastrophe, even after the loss of everything, some fragment survives. Some story is told. Some knowledge is passed down. And from that fragment, the whole can be rebuilt, slowly, painstakingly, over millennia. We're living proof of that. We're here, building computers and spaceships and thinking deep thoughts about the past, because survivors 10,000 years ago refused to let everything die with their world. They kept the flame alive. They taught their children. They preserved what they could. And their children's children's children, hundreds of generations later, built Sumeria and Egypt and the Indus Valley, inscribed the first writing, erected the first monuments. And those civilizations built on each other, preserved and expanded knowledge, until we arrived here, at this moment, able to look back across the entire arc and dimly perceive the pattern. We see further because we stand on the shoulders of giants. That's Newton's phrase, and it's usually interpreted to mean that each generation builds on the work of the previous one, that scientific progress is cumulative. But maybe it's more literal than that. Maybe we stand on the shoulders of actual giants, the first people, the ones the myths call giants and gods and teachers, not because they were physically larger or literally divine, but because from our perspective, separated by such vast time, they loom large. They cast long shadows. Their achievements, fragmentary as our knowledge of them, is still shape what we do, still guide what we build, still whisper in our myths and dreams. We're remembering them now. We're waking the sleeping giants. We're decoding their messages, excavating their monuments, listening to their stories. And as we do, we're recovering not just historical knowledge, but something deeper. The awareness that we're part of a continuum, that human culture extends back much further than our institutions, that we carry within us the accumulated wisdom and trauma of countless generations, including ones we've forgotten. That awareness changes things. It makes us less arrogant, more reverent. It makes us aware that what we think of as progress might be recovery, that what we call innovation might be remembrance. It connects us to a deeper human story, one that encompasses not just the few thousand years of recorded history, but the tens or hundreds of thousands of years of human cultural existence, most of which is lost to us except in traces. And it makes the myths precious, because they're the longest thread we have, the deepest memory, the voice of the ancestors calling to us from the very edge of forgetting. When we listen to a creation myth, a flood story, a tale of wandering teachers, we're hearing something that might have been preserved for 10,000 years, passed from speaker to listener, generation to generation, surviving the collapse of languages and cultures and civilizations, morphing and adapting but never quite disappearing. That's an extraordinary thing. That's a testament to human creativity and stubbornness and the deep need we have to remember, to preserve, to pass forward. So tonight, as you listen to this, as you drift toward sleep with these ideas swirling in your mind, remember that you're part of that chain. You're another listener in the long line of listeners, receiving stories and ideas that have come down through time, that connect you to people who lived and thought and wondered long before you were born. And maybe, if the myths are memory, you're connected to people who lived before even the first civilizations, people whose names we'll never know, whose faces we'll never see, but whose legacy we carry nonetheless. They survived catastrophe. They taught their children. They preserved fragments of knowledge in story and symbol. And because they did, we're here. We're thinking. We're building. We're remembering. That's the real magic of history, the real wonder of archaeology and mythology and all the disciplines that investigate the deep past. It's not just about discovering facts, not just about building accurate timelines, though those things matter. It's about connection. It's about recognizing ourselves in the people who came before, seeing our struggles and triumphs mirrored in theirs, understanding that the questions we ask, where did we come from, what does it mean to be human, how do we survive in the face of disaster, are the same questions they asked. And sometimes, if we listen carefully, we can hear their answers, whispered across the millennia in myths and monuments and fragments of forgotten languages. What if the world's oldest myth comes from a culture we've never identified? What if every culture's oldest myths are fragments of that single source, a narrative so ancient it predates civilization itself, scattered and preserved in pieces across the world? Then the task before us isn't just to study the past, but to reassemble it, to collect the fragments, compare them, look for the underlying pattern, and reconstruct, as best we can, the original story. Not perfectly, we'll never have that, but enough to glimpse what came before, who the first people were, what they achieved, and what we've inherited from them. It's detective work on a civilizational scale. It's archaeology and mythology and linguistics and genetics all woven together, all pointing toward a truth that's been hidden in plain sight for 10,000 years. And the beauty of it, the profound rightness of it, is that we're not working against the myths. We're working with them. We're finally taking the storytellers seriously, listening to what they've been trying to tell us all along. There were people before. They knew. They were lost. We are their inheritors. And if we listen carefully, if we look in the right places, if we're willing to question what we think we know, we might be able to recover what they lost, complete the cycle, and finally, fully remember. That's the gift the myths offer us. Not just stories, but a map. A map of the past, drawn in symbolic language, preserved against all odds, waiting for the generation that would have the tools and the will to decode it. Maybe we're that generation. Maybe this is the moment when the sleeping giants wake, when the lost knowledge is recovered, when the cycle completes and we finally understand the full arc of human story. Or maybe we're just another step in the process, another generation of seekers, adding our own pieces to the puzzle, passing it forward to those who come after, trusting that eventually, someone will see the whole picture. Either way, the work matters. The search matters. The willingness to take the myths seriously, to look beyond the established narratives, to ask uncomfortable questions about the deep past, that matters. Because history isn't just about the past. It's about identity, about understanding who we are and where we come from. And if who we are includes inheritance from a lost civilization, from first people whose names we don't know but whose knowledge we carry, then our identity is older, deeper, richer than we've imagined. We're not just the children of Sumeria and Egypt and Greece and Rome. We're the children of something older, something that existed before the names, before the writing, before the cities. We're the children of the survivors, the ones who refused to let catastrophe be the end, who carried the flame through the darkness and lit it again on the other side. And that makes us responsible. Responsible to remember, to preserve, to pass forward. Responsible to honor the long chain of transmission that brought us here. Responsible to ensure that if catastrophe comes again, something survives, some seed of knowledge and culture that can germinate in the aftermath. The first people, whoever they were, did that. They faced the end of their world and made sure something survived. They became teachers, wanderers, mythmakers. They embedded their knowledge in the cultures they found, knowing it would be distorted, knowing it would be mythologized, but trusting that some core of truth would survive. And it did. It survived in the flood myths, in the stories of skyfire, in the tales of sleeping giants and wandering teachers. It survived in the Sumerian king lists with their impossibly long reigns before the flood. It survived in the Egyptian books of the dead, with their geography of an otherworld that might be memory of a drowned coastline. It survived in the Vedic hymns, with their descriptions of flying vehicles and advanced weaponry. It survived in the Aboriginal songlines, encoding landscapes from before the sea level rise. It survived because people kept telling the stories. Because generation after generation, someone said to their children, "This is important, remember this, pass it on." And the children did, even when they no longer understood the literal meaning, even when the stories became fantastical and symbolic, even when the original context was lost. The act of preservation itself was enough. The commitment to remembering was enough. And now, thousands of years later, we can start to decode what was preserved, to recover the historical content beneath the mythological elaboration. That's the project. That's the work. And it's a work that requires patience, humility, imagination, and a willingness to be wrong. Because we're working with fragmentary evidence, with ambiguous data, with stories that have been transformed by countless retellings. We won't get it all right. We'll make mistakes. We'll propose theories that turn out to be false. But that's how inquiry works. We form hypotheses, test them against evidence, revise them when they fail. We build models, tear them down, build better ones. We argue and debate and examine and re-examine, always trying to get closer to truth, knowing we'll never reach it completely but finding meaning in the pursuit. And along the way, we'll discover things, real things, new archaeological sites, new genetic data, new linguistic connections. We'll push back the boundaries of what we know about human history. We'll add chapters to the story, fill in blanks, correct errors. And maybe, just maybe, we'll confirm that the myths were right, that there was something before, that the wandering teachers were real in some form, that we are the inheritors of a knowledge tradition that stretches back not just thousands but tens of thousands of years, back beyond the dawn of writing, back beyond the first cities, back to a time we've called prehistoric but which was, in fact, fully human, fully cultural, fully worthy of being remembered. If that's true, then every time we advance in knowledge, every time we discover something new, we're not moving forward into uncharted territory. We're moving backward into memory. We're recovering what the first people knew, what was lost in the catastrophe, what the survivors tried so hard to preserve. We're completing the circle. We're fulfilling the promise implicit in the myths, that what was lost would be found again, that the sleeping giants would wake, that the knowledge would return. And when we look at it that way, the future becomes less uncertain. Because we're not groping in the dark, hoping to stumble upon truth. We're following a path that's been walked before. We're tracing footsteps that are already there, faint but discernible, leading us back to the source. The myths are the footprints. The monuments are the markers. The oral traditions are the voices calling us forward, backward, inward, toward the center of the mystery. And at the center, maybe we'll find ourselves, not as we are now, but as we were before, and as we will be again. Because if history is cyclical, if civilization rises and falls and rises, then we're not just recovering the past. We're glimpsing the future. We're seeing what we might become again, if we survive, if we preserve, if we pass forward the flame. That's a heavy thought. It's also a beautiful one. It means that nothing is ever truly lost, not permanently. It means that knowledge, once discovered, has a kind of immortality. It will be forgotten, obscured, distorted, but it will survive in some form, waiting to be rediscovered, ready to be reborn. The wheel turns. The cycle continues. The giants sleep and wake. The flood comes and recedes. The teachers wander and teach and vanish, only to return in new forms, with new names, carrying the same ancient wisdom in new containers. We are those teachers now, whether we realize it or not. We're the ones with the knowledge, the ones who survived the latest iteration of the cycle, the ones responsible for passing it forward. What we do now, how we preserve and share what we've learned, will determine what survives if our own civilization falls. Will we encode our knowledge in durable forms? Will we create monuments that future archaeologists can find? Will we teach our children not just facts, but the importance of memory, of preservation, of respecting the wisdom of those who came before? Or will we assume that progress is inevitable, that knowledge once gained can never be lost, that our institutions will last forever? The first people probably thought that too. Every civilization does. Every age believes itself to be the pinnacle, the end of history, the final form. And every age is wrong. The cycle continues. The wheel turns. And the only thing that saves knowledge from total oblivion is the decision to preserve it, to encode it, to pass it down, even at great cost, even when the reason is forgotten, even when it seems unnecessary. The myths survived because people made that decision over and over for 10,000 years. They told the stories even when they didn't fully understand them. They performed the rituals even when the original meaning was lost. They preserved the symbols even when they could no longer decode them. And because of that stubbornness, that cultural tenacity, that deep human commitment to memory, we have something to work with. We have clues. We have fragments. We have a starting point for recovery. If we're wise, we'll do the same. We'll create our own time capsules, our own indestructible monuments, our own methods of preserving knowledge across catastrophe. Not because we expect our civilization to fall, we hope it won't, but because prudence demands it. Because the myths teach us that catastrophe happens, civilizations fall, and the only defense is preservation. That's the practical lesson of the wandering teachers. They didn't prevent the catastrophe. They couldn't. But they survived it, and they made sure the knowledge survived with them. That's all we can do, all any generation can do. Preserve what matters, pass it forward, and trust that those who come after will do the same. It's a long view. It's a multi-generational, multi-millennial perspective. It's thinking beyond our own lifespans, beyond our own cultures, beyond our own civilizations, to the long arc of human story that encompasses all of us, all the way back to the first people and all the way forward to whoever comes last. And it's a view that the myths give us, because they're the longest records we have, the deepest memories, the voices of the ancestors speaking across time. When we listen to them, when we take them seriously, we're connecting to that long arc, seeing ourselves as part of it, accepting our role in the great chain of transmission. So where does this leave us tonight? As you lie in the dark, listening to these ideas, drifting towards sleep, it leaves us with questions, which is where the best inquiries always end. not with answers that close down thought, but with questions that open it up, that invite further exploration, that make us want to look deeper, think harder, imagine more fully. What if the myths are memory? What if there were people before, sophisticated cultures lost to catastrophe, whose survivors became the teachers of the civilizations we know? What if the cycle is real and we're living in the recovery phase, rebuilding what was lost, remembering what was forgotten? What if every story of wandering teachers, every flood myth, every tale of sleeping giants and sky fire, is a fragment of the same underlying narrative, a story so old it predates civilization itself, scattered across the world and preserved in pieces? What if the task before us isn't to invent the future, but to remember the past, to recover knowledge that was once possessed and then lost, to complete a cycle that's been turning for tens of thousands of years? And what if we're not alone in this? What if the first people, whoever they were, encoded messages for us, left clues in monuments and symbols and stories, hoping that someday, someone would decode them, understand them, and complete the work they began? These are the questions the myths provoke. These are the thoughts they inspire. And while we may never have definitive answers, while the evidence may always remain fragmentary and ambiguous, the questions themselves are valuable. They make us think differently about history, about human potential, about our place in the long story of our species. They make us humble, aware that others came before us, achieved things we're only now recovering, and were lost despite their sophistication. They make us reverent, grateful for the knowledge we've inherited, aware of its fragility and preciousness. They make us responsible, conscious that we're links in a chain, that what we preserve and pass forward matters, that our choices today affect not just our children but potentially cultures that won't exist for thousands of years. That's a profound shift in perspective. It's moving from seeing ourselves as isolated individuals or even isolated civilizations to seeing ourselves as part of a multimillennial human project. A long, slow process of accumulating, losing, and recovering knowledge, of rising and falling and rising again, of learning and forgetting and relearning the same fundamental truths about the universe and our place in it. The myths have been trying to tell us this all along. We just weren't listening carefully enough. We heard gods and monsters and magic, and we dismissed the stories as primitive fantasy. But beneath the gods were teachers. Beneath the monsters were memories of catastrophe. Beneath the magic was sophisticated knowledge, encoded in symbolic language, preserved against the decay of time. And now, finally, we have the tools to decode it. We have archaeology to excavate the physical remnants. We have genetics to trace the human lineages. We have linguistics to reconstruct the lost languages. We have climatology to understand the catastrophes. We have comparative mythology to identify the patterns. We have everything we need to test the hypothesis that the myths are memory. And that's what we should do. Not with credulous acceptance of every fantastical claim, but with rigorous, open-minded investigation. Looking for the historical core beneath the mythological elaboration. Seeking the patterns that can't be explained by coincidence or universal psychology alone. Following the thread the storytellers left us, seeing where it leads. Maybe it leads to confirmation. Maybe we'll find underwater ruins, genetic signatures, linguistic substrates, all pointing to the same conclusion. There was something before, something sophisticated, something lost. Maybe we'll be able to say with confidence, yes, the myths were right, there were first people, and this is what we know about them. Or maybe it leads to a more nuanced understanding. Maybe we'll discover that the pattern is more complex than a single lost civilization, that it's really multiple cultures, multiple catastrophes, multiple cycles of rise and fall, all compressed and conflated in the mythological memory. Maybe the wandering teachers weren't refugees from one place, but from many places, survivors of multiple disasters, all carrying fragments of knowledge from their own lost worlds. Or maybe we'll find that the conventional explanations are correct after all, that the myths arose independently, that the similarities are due to universal human psychology and shared environmental experiences, that there's no lost civilization to recover. Even then, even if the literal hypothesis fails, the exercise will have been valuable, because it will have forced us to engage seriously with the myths, to examine them as potential historical sources, to develop better methods for distinguishing memory from invention in oral traditions. It will have expanded our understanding of how ancient peoples thought, how they preserved information, how they conceptualized their own past. And it will have reminded us that human history is long, complex, and full of surprises, that we don't know everything, that there are still mysteries to solve, still questions to answer, still depths to plumb. That's the value of the question, regardless of the answer. It keeps us curious, keeps us humble, keeps us looking, investigating, thinking, wondering. And those are the qualities that drive all genuine inquiry, all real discovery, all meaningful advancement in understanding. So let's stay curious. Let's keep asking uncomfortable questions. Let's keep examining anomalies, listening to myths, looking for patterns. Let's keep digging, literally and figuratively, for evidence of the deep past. Let's keep combining disciplines, integrating data, building models, testing hypotheses. And let's keep telling the stories. Because whether the myths are literal history or symbolic truth or pure fiction, they're our inheritance. They connect us to the long chain of storytellers who came before us, who preserved what they thought was important, who passed it down generation after generation, trusting that it would matter to someone, someday. It matters to us now. These ancient stories, told around fires and carved in stone and whispered from parent to child across millennia, they matter. They tell us who we are, where we came from, what our ancestors thought was worth preserving. They tell us that memory is important, that knowledge is fragile, that cultural transmission is the most human of all human activities. And they tell us that we're part of something larger than ourselves, part of a species-wide project of understanding and remembering, of accumulating knowledge and passing it forward, of building civilizations and watching them fall and building them again, always trying, always learning, always hoping that this time we'll get it right, we'll preserve it better, we'll survive longer. We probably won't. History suggests that no civilization lasts forever, that catastrophe is always lurking, that the wheel will turn again. But maybe, just maybe, each iteration gets a little better at preservation. Each cycle leaves a little more behind. Each fall is a little less complete, a little more recoverable. The first people, if they existed, left myths and monuments and maybe underwater ruins. If we fall, we'll leave more. We'll leave books and hard drives and satellites, languages and mathematics and scientific knowledge encoded in 1,000 forms. Some of it will survive. Some future generation will find it, decode it, marvel at it, and use it to rebuild. And they'll tell stories about us, just as we tell stories about the first people. We'll become their wandering teachers, their wise ancestors, their sleeping giants. We'll be mythologized and distorted and half-remembered, but we'll be remembered. Something of us will survive. That's the promise and the responsibility. The promise that we're not forgotten, that what we do matters beyond our lifetimes. The responsibility to do things worth remembering, to preserve knowledge worth recovering, to pass forward wisdom worth inheriting. The myths tell us that others accepted that responsibility before us. They built monuments meant to last millennia. They encoded knowledge in durable forms. They taught their children to remember and retell. And because of their efforts, something survived the catastrophes, something reached across the abyss of time to us. Now it's our turn. What will we preserve? What will we encode? What will we pass forward? What will future generations find when they excavate our ruins and decode our myths and try to understand what we were? I hope they find evidence of wisdom. I hope they find that we learned from the past, that we understood the fragility of civilization, that we took steps to preserve what matters. I hope they find that we were good ancestors, mindful of their needs even though we'd never meet them, working to leave them something valuable. But even if we fail at that, even if our preservation efforts are inadequate, even if too little survives, well, the myths teach us that even fragments are valuable. Even scraps of story, even damaged monuments, even isolated pieces of knowledge can be meaningful, can be combined and examined and used to reconstruct, partially at least, what came before. So whatever we do, whatever we preserve, it's not nothing. It's a contribution to the long human project of memory and transmission. It's our link in the chain. And maybe, impossibly, some of it will survive for 10,000 years the way the myths survived, and will speak to people we can't imagine, telling them, We were here, we thought about these things, we wondered about you, we tried to leave you something useful. That's the best we can do. That's what the myths model for us. Not perfection, not complete preservation, not immunity to catastrophe. Just the stubborn insistence on remembering, on passing forward, on maturing across time. The wandering teachers, whether they were real or symbolic, represent that insistence. They're the embodiment of the human drive to preserve knowledge against all odds, to teach even when the world is ending, to pass forward the flame even when everything else is darkness. We are those teachers now. We're always those teachers. Every generation is, whether we recognize it or not. We're all wandering through time, carrying what we know, teaching what we can, hoping that something of value reaches those who come after us. And we're all students too. Students of the past, learning from those who came before, trying to understand what they knew, what they preserved, what they were trying to tell us. The myths are our curriculum. The monuments are our textbooks. The oral traditions are our lectures, delivered across millennia. If we approach them with humility and curiosity, if we listen carefully, if we're willing to question our assumptions, we can learn. We can recover what was lost. We can complete the cycle. We can become worthy inheritors of the first people, whoever they were, by taking seriously what they left behind and building on it, adding our own knowledge, passing the whole thing forward to the next iteration. That's the goal. Not to definitively prove or disprove any particular theory about lost civilizations. Not to win arguments or establish orthodoxies. But to engage seriously with the deep past, to honor the long arc of human story, to see ourselves as part of something ancient and ongoing and profound. The myths give us that perspective. They're windows into deep time, connections to ancestors so distant we don't even know their names, yet whose influence we still feel, whose knowledge we still use, whose stories we still tell. When we listen to a creation myth, we're hearing the voice of someone who lived thousands of years ago, who thought it was important to explain how the world came to be, who wanted their descendants to understand. We're the descendants they were addressing. We're the ones the story was preserved for. And when we investigate the historical content of those myths, when we look for correlations with archaeology and genetics and climatology, we're honoring the storytellers. We're saying, you were trying to tell us something true, and we're finally ready to listen. We finally have the tools to understand what you meant, to recover the history you were preserving. That's a profound act of respect, of connection across time. It's treating the ancients not as primitive others, but as fellow humans, intelligent and observant and concerned with truth, doing the best they could with the knowledge and technology they had. And when we see them that way, the myths transform. They're no longer quaint folktales or primitive superstitions. They're historical testimony, encoded in the only durable medium available to preliterate peoples: story. They're libraries without books, museums without buildings, archives preserved in human memory and passed down through speech and song and ritual. They're miraculous when you think about it, that information can survive for 10,000 years, transmitted orally, remaining coherent and meaningful despite countless retellings and translations and cultural transformations. That's a testament to the power of story, to the human capacity for memory, to the importance of cultural continuity. And it means we should be creating our own myths, encoding our own knowledge in story form, ensuring that even if all our books burn and all our hard drives fail and all our civilizational infrastructure collapses, something will survive in the form of tales that people find compelling enough to retell. That's what the myths do. They're compelling. They're memorable. They stick in the mind. They get repeated. And because of that, they survive even when everything else is lost. So maybe the oldest myth, the one that all the others are fragments of, is simply this: there were people. They learned things. They tried to preserve what they learned. They faced catastrophe. Some survived. They taught others. The cycle continued. That's the you are myth, the master narrative, the story that every culture tells in its own way because it's fundamentally true. It's the story of humanity itself, repeated across ages, elaborated with specific details and cultural color, but always the same at its core. We knew, we fell, we survived, we taught, we're here. And embedded in that simple narrative is everything that matters: memory, resilience, transmission, continuity. The things that make us human, that distinguish us from other animals, that allow us to accumulate knowledge across generations and build on what came before. The myths preserve that meta-narrative. They remind us over and over that this is what we do. This is what it means to be human. We remember, we preserve, we pass forward. Even in the face of catastrophe, even when everything else fails, we tell the story. And as long as the story survives, we survive. Not as individuals, not even as specific cultures, but as a species, as a project, as an ongoing experiment in consciousness and knowledge and meaning-making. That's what the myths are really about. Not about specific lost civilizations or ancient astronauts or any particular historical claim, but about the persistence of human culture itself, the stubborn refusal to let knowledge die, the commitment to memory that spans not just generations but ages. And that's a story worth retelling. That's a story worth listening to. That's a story worth falling asleep to, letting it sink into your unconscious, letting it reshape how you think about the past and the future and your place in the long human story. Because you are part of that story. You're another listener, another link in the chain, another generation receiving the myths and deciding what to do with them. Will you dismiss them? Will you take them seriously? Will you add your own understanding, your own investigation, your own contribution to the long process of recovery and remembrance? That's up to you. But the myths are here waiting. They've been waiting for 10,000 years, and they'll wait longer if necessary. They're patient, these old stories. They know that eventually someone will listen. Someone will understand. Someone will decode what they're trying to say and complete the work the first people began. Maybe that someone is you. Maybe you're the one who'll make the connection, ask the right question, see the pattern that everyone else has missed. Maybe you're the one who'll help wake the sleeping giants, recover the lost knowledge, complete the cycle. Or maybe you're just another listener, like billions before you, receiving the stories, appreciating them, passing them on slightly changed to the next generation. That's valuable too. That's essential. Because without listeners, the stories die. Without people willing to receive and retell, the chain breaks. So thank you for listening. Thank you for being here tonight, in the dark, considering these ideas, letting them play across your mind as you drift towards sleep. Thank you for being part of the long chain of listeners that extends back to the first people and forward to whoever comes last. You're important. Your attention matters. Your willingness to consider alternative narratives, to question established assumptions, to wonder about the deep past, that matters. Because that's how knowledge advances, how understanding deepens, how the cycle continues. And maybe, just maybe, one of these ideas will take root in your mind, will grow into a question you'll investigate, a connection you'll make, a contribution you'll offer to the long human project of understanding where we came from and what we're doing here. The myths suggest that we've been through this before, that others asked these questions, pursued these investigations, made these discoveries, and then were lost, forcing us to start over. But each time we start over, we bring something with us. We bring fragments, echoes, memories. We bring the myths themselves, which encode enough information to guide us back toward what was known before. So we're not starting from zero. We're starting from the myths, from the monuments, from the oral traditions. We're starting from the foundation the first people left us, however damaged and fragmentary it might be. And that gives us an advantage. We don't have to discover everything from scratch. We can follow the map the myths provide. We can look where they tell us to look, ask the questions they prompt, make the connections they suggest. We can stand on the shoulders of giants, as Newton said. Literal giants, mythological giants, cultural giants stretching back into the mists of deep time. We can use their knowledge, build on their foundations, complete the work they began. That's the promise hidden in the myths, that we're not alone, not isolated, not starting from nothing. We're part of a continuum, a long chain of human inquiry and achievement that extends far back into the past and will extend far into the future. And that continuum is more important than any individual link in the chain. We'll all die, every one of us. Our civilizations will fall as all civilizations do. But the chain continues. The knowledge persists in some form. The myths survive. The project goes on. That's comforting, in a strange way. It means that failure isn't final, that loss isn't total, that even catastrophe can be survived. As long as someone remembers, as long as someone tells the story, the chain holds. And we're responsible for maintaining our link. We're responsible for learning what we can, preserving what we learn, teaching what we know, and passing the whole thing forward to the next generation. That's our job, our purpose, our contribution to the species-wide project. Whether we discover definitive proof of lost civilizations or not, whether we confirm the myths or refine them or revise them entirely, we're participating in the ongoing human effort to understand ourselves and our past. And that participation, that engagement, that willingness to ask and investigate and think, that's what matters. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, carry with you the awareness that you're part of something larger, part of the long story of human memory and transmission, part of the cycle of loss and recovery, part of the chain that connects the first people to the last people, spanning however many thousands or millions of years that turns out to be. The myths connect you to that story. They're your link to the ancestors, your inheritance from the deep past, your responsibility to the far future. They're telling you that others came before, that others will come after, and that what you do in the brief span of your life matters to both. So live accordingly. Learn, preserve, teach, remember, honor the long chain you're part of. Add your link with care and thoughtfulness. Leave something valuable for those who come after. And listen to the myths. Not just the ones I've talked about tonight, but all of them. Every culture's stories, every tradition's tales. Listen for the patterns. Listen for the repetitions. Listen for the signal beneath the noise. Because somewhere in those stories, encoded in symbolic language, preserved across unimaginable spans of time, is the truth about who we are and where we came from. It's there waiting to be decoded, waiting for the generation that will have the tools and the will to extract it. Maybe we're that generation. Maybe the moment is now. Maybe the convergence of archaeology and genetics and linguistics and computational analysis will allow us, finally, to confirm what the myths have been telling us all along. Or maybe we're just another step in the process, another iteration of seekers, adding our own pieces to the puzzle but not completing it, passing the partially assembled picture forward to those who come after, trusting that eventually someone will finish. Either way, the work is worthwhile. The search is meaningful. The question matters, even if the answer remains elusive. Because in pursuing the question, we're doing what humans have always done. Trying to understand, trying to remember, trying to connect to those who came before and those who will come after. We're maintaining the chain. We're honoring the ancestors. We're building the foundation for the descendants. We're being human in the deepest, most profound sense of that word. Thinking, remembering, preserving, transmitting. Creating culture and knowledge and meaning and passing them forward, hoping they'll survive, knowing they might not, but trying anyway because that's what we do, what we've always done, what the myths tell us we'll always do. As long as there are humans, there will be stories. And as long as there are stories, the first people will be remembered in some form. Their names may be forgotten, their specific achievements may be lost, but the fact of them, the reality that they existed and knew things and tried to preserve what they knew, that will survive. Because it's encoded in every myth of wandering teachers, every flood story, every tale of sleeping giants. It's there waiting to be recognized, waiting to be taken seriously, waiting for us to complete the cycle they began. So let's do that. Let's complete the cycle. Let's remember what was forgotten. Let's recover what was lost. Let's become the generation that finally understands what the myths have been trying to tell us for 10,000 years. Not because we're special or uniquely qualified, but because we're here, now, with the tools and the opportunity and the responsibility. Because we're the latest link in the chain, and it's our turn to add our contribution, our understanding, our piece of the puzzle. The first people are waiting. They've been waiting, sleeping beneath the earth and sea, encoded in myths and monuments, ready to wake when we finally ask the right questions and look in the right places. So let's wake them. Let's listen to what they have to teach us. Let's recover what they tried so hard to preserve. Let's honor their effort by completing the work, by remembering fully, by understanding deeply. And then let's do for the future what they did for us. Let's encode our knowledge in durable forms. Let's create monuments and stories that will survive whatever catastrophes come. Let's ensure that if our civilization falls, something survives, some seed of knowledge that can germinate in the aftermath. Because the cycle will continue. That's what the myths teach us. Rise and fall, loss and recovery, amnesia and remembrance. It's the pattern of human history, repeated across ages. And our responsibility in whatever age we live in is to preserve what we can, to pass forward what we know, to be good ancestors to the generations we'll never meet. That's the lesson of the wandering teachers. They didn't prevent their own civilization's fall, but they survived it, and they made sure something of value survived with them. They became teachers, wanderers, mythmakers. They seeded the future with fragments of the past. And now we're the future they seeded. We're the ones benefiting from their efforts. We're the ones who can, if we choose, recover what they preserved and build on it. So let's choose that. Let's honor their efforts by taking the myths seriously. Let's investigate, explore, excavate, analyze. Let's combine disciplines and data sources and perspectives. Let's build a comprehensive picture of the deep past, incorporating all the evidence, archaeological, genetic, linguistic, mythological. And let's tell our own stories. Let's create our own myths, encoding what we know, what we've learned, what we think matters. Let's contribute to the long human story, adding our chapter, our voice, our understanding. Because 10,000 years from now, someone might be listening to stories about us, trying to figure out who we were, what we knew, what we were trying to preserve. And I hope they find that we were good ancestors, that we thought about them, that we tried to leave them something valuable, that we were teachers, in our own way, wandering through time, carrying knowledge, passing it forward, hoping it would survive, trusting that someone, someday, would appreciate it. That's what the myths model for us. That's what the first people did, if they existed. And that's what we should do, whether we're the first or the latest or somewhere in between. We should be the people the myths describe. Wise, far-seeing, committed to preservation, willing to teach even when the world is ending, stubborn enough to pass the flame forward even through the darkness. That's how civilizations survive, not as physical structures, but as knowledge traditions, as cultural transmissions, as stories that encode essential truths and pass them across generations. The myths have survived for 10,000 years because people like you, people across countless generations, have listened and retold, have valued and preserved, have understood that these stories matter even when their literal meaning is obscure. And now it's your turn. You've heard the stories tonight. You've considered the ideas. You've let them into your mind. What will you do with them? Will you dismiss them as interesting speculation and move on? That's fine. Not everything has to transform us. Will you investigate further, explore the sources, read about Göbekli Tepe and genetic bottlenecks and comparative mythology? That's valuable. The more people engage seriously with these questions, the better our collective understanding becomes. Will you tell someone else about these ideas, passing them forward, adding another link to the chain of transmission? That's how ideas survive, how they spread, how they evolve. Or will you simply let them rest in your unconscious, let them do whatever work they do beneath the surface of awareness, let them subtly reshape how you think about the past and the future and your place in human story? That's powerful too. Sometimes the most important changes happen quietly, in the dark, while we sleep. Whatever you do, you're part of the process now. You've engaged with the possibility that the myths are memory, that there were first people, that we're recovering what was lost. And that engagement, however deep or shallow, brief or sustained, connects you to the long chain of inquirers who've asked these questions before and will ask them after. You're part of human history now, not just as a person who lives in history, but as someone who thinks about it, wonders about it, engages with the deep questions it raises. And that matters. That's part of what makes us human, what distinguishes us, what allows us to accumulate knowledge across time. So thank you again for listening, for being here, for engaging with ideas that don't have easy answers, that require patience and imagination and willingness to sit with uncertainty. The myths have been waiting for listeners like you. Listeners who will take them seriously without being credulous, who will investigate without prejudging, who will wonder without demanding immediate certainty. And maybe you'll be the one who makes the crucial connection, who sees the pattern everyone else has missed, who helps wake the sleeping giants and recover the lost knowledge. Or maybe you'll just be another link in the chain, passing these ideas forward slightly transformed, adding your own understanding, your own questions, your own contribution to the long conversation about where we came from and what we're doing here. Either way, you matter. Your engagement matters. Your attention tonight has been part of the process of recovery and remembrance. You've participated in the great human project of trying to understand ourselves and our past. And that's something to be proud of. That's something to value. That's something the first people, if they're watching somehow, would appreciate. Because you're doing what they tried to ensure would happen. You're remembering. You're thinking about what came before. You're considering the possibility that they existed, that they mattered, that they have something to teach us. You're being a good descendant, a worthy inheritor, a conscientious link in the chain. So sleep well tonight, knowing that you're part of something ancient and ongoing and profound, that you're connected to the first people and to the last people, to all the humans who ever asked these questions and ever will. The myths link us all, across time and space, into one great conversation about meaning and memory and what it means to be human. And tonight, you've joined that conversation. You've added your attention, your consideration, your engagement. And somewhere, somehow, across the vast span of time that separates us from the first people, maybe they know. Maybe they're pleased that their efforts at preservation weren't in vain, that the stories survived, that someone is still listening. Maybe the sleeping giants are stirring. Maybe the cycle is turning toward completion. Maybe this is the age when we finally remember fully, when we recover what was lost, when we understand what the myths have been trying to tell us all along. Or maybe we're just another iteration in a long series, another generation of seekers, making our incremental contribution and passing the incomplete puzzle forward. That's okay too. That's how the process works. Slow, cumulative, spanning countless generations, but always moving, always progressing, always working toward the moment of full remembrance. And each generation that engages with the question, that takes the myths seriously, that investigates the deep past with openness and rigor, each such generation brings us a little closer, adds a few more pieces to the puzzle, clarifies the picture a little more. We might not complete it in our lifetimes. We probably won't. But we can add our pieces, our understanding, our insights. We can move the project forward. We can be good ancestors to those who will continue the work after we're gone. That's all we can do, really. Our individual lifespans are too short to complete the great projects of human understanding. But collectively, across generations, we can accomplish what no individual could. We can accumulate knowledge, build on what came before, pass forward what we've learned. That's what the myths teach us. That's what the first people did, if they existed. And that's what we should do in our turn. We should learn. We should question. We should investigate. We should preserve. We should teach. We should pass forward. And we should do it all with humility, aware that we don't have all the answers, that future generations will correct our errors and build on our insights, that the work is never finished, only continued. That's the wisdom encoded in the myths. Not specific historical facts, though those might be there too. But the meta-wisdom, the understanding that knowledge is a multigenerational project, that memory is fragile but preservable, that catastrophe happens but can be survived, that humans are capable of remarkable preservation and transmission across time. If we take that wisdom seriously, it changes how we approach everything. How we think about education, about cultural preservation, about our responsibility to the future. It makes us aware that we're not just living our own lives, but participating in something much larger and longer. It makes us ancestors in waiting. People who will someday be the past, who will someday be the subjects of investigation, who will someday be remembered or forgotten depending on what we choose to preserve and pass forward. What kind of ancestors do we want to be? What legacy do we want to leave? What will future generations say about us when they excavate our ruins and decode our myths and try to understand what we knew and what we tried to preserve? I hope they'll say we were thoughtful, that we learned from the past, that we understood our responsibility to the future, that we preserved what mattered, that we were good links in the chain. And I hope they'll say we listened to the myths, that we took the stories seriously, that we honored the effort of those who came before by trying to understand what they were telling us. Because the myths are a gift from the past. They're the longest message we've received, the deepest memory we possess. And how we respond to them says something about who we are, about whether we're worthy of the inheritance we've received. So let's be worthy. Let's listen. Let's investigate. Let's remember. Let's honor the first people by taking seriously what they tried so hard to preserve. And let's pass it forward. Let's be the wandering teachers for the next generation. Let's encode what we know in durable forms. Let's tell stories that will survive. Let's create myths that will carry our essential truths forward into the far future. Because the cycle continues. The wheel turns. And our moment, our age, our civilization, it's just one turn of the wheel, one iteration of the cycle. It will end as all things do. But what we preserve, what we pass forward, what we encode in story and symbol and monument, that can survive. That can carry across the catastrophe to the next iteration. And someday someone will wake the giants again. Someone will listen to the myths and recognize them as memory. Someone will excavate our ruins and understand what we were trying to say. And I hope they'll find that we were part of the long chain of preservation, that we contributed our link, that we honored those who came before and thought carefully about those who would come after. That's the goal. Not to be the final generation, the ones who complete the work, but to be good ancestors, faithful links, worthy inheritors who become worthy bequeathers. To receive the myths gratefully, investigate them seriously, and pass them forward enriched by our understanding. To add our voice to the great conversation that spans ages. To participate in the species-wide project of memory and meaning-making. That's what it means to be human in the deepest sense. To remember, to preserve, to transmit. To honor the past and serve the future. To maintain the chain that connects all humans across time. And tonight, by listening to these ideas, by engaging with these questions, by considering the possibility that the myths are memory and that there were first people whose knowledge we're recovering, tonight you've participated in that great project. You've been a listener in the long line of listeners, a link in the chain of transmission, a participant in the ongoing effort to understand where we came from and what we're doing here. And that matters. You matter. Your attention, your engagement, your willingness to wonder about the deep past. It all matters. Because without listeners, the stories die. Without people like you, willing to engage with ideas that don't have easy answers, the great conversation ends. Without curious, thoughtful people asking questions and investigating and thinking deeply, the cycle stops. But you're here. You listened. You engaged. You wondered. And because of that, the cycle continues. The chain holds. The project goes on. So thank you. Thank you for being part of this. Thank you for listening tonight. Thank you for being willing to consider that the world is older and stranger and more mysterious than we've been taught. Thank you for honoring the first people, whoever they were, by taking seriously what they tried to preserve. Thank you for being a good link in the chain, a faithful steward of memory, a worthy inheritor of the long human tradition of asking big questions and seeking deep answers. The myths have been waiting for you. The sleeping giants have been waiting for you. The first people across the vast gulf of time have been waiting for someone like you. Someone who would listen, who would wonder, who would take their stories seriously and investigate what they were trying to tell us. And now you've heard them. You've considered their message. You've engaged with the possibility that they're right, that there were people before, that knowledge was lost and preserved, that we're recovering what they tried so hard to save. What you do with that is up to you. But you've been changed slightly by the encounter. You've been connected to the deep past in a new way. You've become part of the story, part of the great human project of memory and transmission. And that connection, that participation, that willingness to engage, it ripples forward. It affects how you think about history, about progress, about your place in the long arc of human story. It makes you more aware, more thoughtful, more conscious of your role as a link in the chain. And maybe, just maybe, it inspires you to be a better ancestor, to think more carefully about what you preserve and pass forward, to consider the long-term implications of your choices, to live with awareness that you're not just an isolated individual, but part of something multigenerational, something that extends deep into the past and far into the future. That would be a fitting response to the myths. to let them inspire us to be better links in the chain, more conscious participants in the great project of human cultural transmission, to be the wandering teachers for the next generation, carrying what we know, teaching what we can, passing the flame forward even if the world seems to be darkening. Because that's what the myths model. That's what they're calling us to do. Not just to understand the past, but to be responsible for the future. Not just to receive the inheritance, but to pass it forward enriched. The first people, if they existed, didn't just try to survive. They tried to ensure that what they knew would survive with them, that the knowledge would reach across the catastrophe to the other side. They became teachers, culture bearers, myth makers. And we should do the same. We should be thinking about the long term, about what survives if our civilization falls, about what we want to pass forward to those who come after. That's the responsibility that comes with consciousness, with cultural sophistication, with knowledge of the fragility of civilization. We know it can all be lost. The myths tell us so. History confirms it. And that knowledge obligates us to preserve, to prepare, to encode what matters in durable forms. So let's do that. Let's be intentional about preservation. Let's create modern monuments, modern myths, modern methods of transmitting knowledge across potential catastrophe. Let's ensure that if we fall having tried to give the future something to build on. And let's keep investigating the past. Let's keep asking whether the myths are memory. Let's keep looking for evidence of lost civilizations, of first people, of knowledge traditions that predate recorded history. Not with credulous acceptance of every fringe theory, but with open-minded rigor, willing to follow evidence wherever it leads. Because if the myths are even partially true, if there was something before the civilizations we know, then recovering that knowledge is one of the most important tasks we can undertake. It would reshape our understanding of human history, human potential, human resilience. And even if the literal hypothesis is wrong, even if there were no first people in the sense we've been discussing, the investigation itself is valuable. It teaches us to think differently about the deep past, to take oral traditions seriously, to look for patterns across cultures, to integrate multiple disciplines. It makes us better historians, better anthropologists, better thinkers about human culture and its long arc. So the project is worthwhile regardless of the outcome. The search itself is meaningful. The questions themselves are valuable. And you, by engaging with them tonight, have participated in something important. You've been part of the long conversation about human origins and human destiny. You've connected to the deepest questions of our species. Where did we come from? What have we forgotten? What are we trying to recover? Those questions don't have easy answers. They probably don't have final answers. But they have provisional answers, working hypotheses, frameworks for organizing the evidence. And those frameworks evolve as we learn more, as we excavate more sites, as we decode more languages, as we map more genomes. The picture is becoming clearer, slowly but steadily. And each person who engages seriously with the question, who investigates with open-minded rigor, who contributes a piece of evidence or a new perspective, each such person helps advance the project. You can be one of those people. You can contribute in whatever way your skills and interests allow. You can investigate or support those who do. You can preserve oral traditions, or learn ancient languages, or excavate archaeological sites, or analyze genetic data, or simply think carefully about the patterns and share your insights. There's a role for everyone in the great project of recovering human history. And the myths are calling us all to participate, each in our own way, each adding our unique contribution to the collective effort. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, as these ideas settle into your unconscious, as your mind processes and integrates what you've heard, know that you're part of something larger, part of the long human story, part of the chain of transmission, part of the project of waking the sleeping giants and recovering what was lost. You matter. Your engagement matters. Your willingness to wonder about the deep past, to consider alternative narratives, to take the myths seriously, it all matters. Because you're a link in the chain. And every link matters. Every generation matters. Every individual who engages with these questions and adds their understanding matters. The first people, if they're watching, would be proud. They tried so hard to preserve their knowledge, to pass it forward, to ensure that something survived the catastrophe. And now, 10,000 years later, here you are, listening, wondering, investigating, taking their stories seriously. Their effort wasn't in vain. The chain held. The stories survived. And you're part of the generation that might finally understand what they were trying to tell us. So sleep well, knowing you're part of that continuity, that long arc of human memory and transmission. Sleep with the awareness that you're connected to the deepest past and the furthest future, that you're a participant in the great project of human understanding. And dream, perhaps, of the first people, of who they were, what they knew, what they achieved. Dream of the lost world that the myths remember, the civilization that drowned, the knowledge that was preserved in fragments. Dream of wandering teachers, carrying wisdom across a transformed landscape, finding isolated communities and teaching what they remembered. Dream of monuments built to outlast catastrophe, of stories told around fires, of knowledge encoded in symbol and myth. Dream of the cycle turning, of civilizations rising and falling and rising again, of humans persisting despite everything, always learning, always remembering, always trying to understand. And when you wake, carry that dream with you. Carry the awareness that you're part of something ancient and ongoing. That the myths are real in the sense that matters most. They're real memories, real attempts at preservation, real gifts from the past. And they're asking something of you. Not to believe uncritically, not to abandon rigorous thinking, but to engage seriously with the possibility that we don't know everything about the deep past, that there might be lost chapters of human story, that the myths might be telling us something true. They're asking you to be curious, humble, open-minded, to investigate, to question, to wonder, to be a good link in the chain of transmission, receiving gratefully what came before and passing forward thoughtfully what you've learned. That's all. That's the ask. Be curious. Be engaged. Be part of the great human project of remembering and understanding. And in being that, in engaging with these questions, in taking the myths seriously, you honor the first people. You honor all the generations who preserved the stories. You honor the long chain of human cultural transmission that brought us from the deep past to this present moment. You honor the sleeping giants by working to wake them. You honor the wandering teachers by being one yourself, in your own way, passing forward what you know. You honor the cycle by participating in it consciously, aware of your role as both recipient and transmitter. And that's a beautiful thing. That's a meaningful thing. That's something to be proud of. So rest tonight with the satisfaction of having engaged with something profound, something ancient, something that connects you to the deepest currents of human history and human consciousness. Rest knowing that you've listened to the myths, that you've considered what they're trying to tell us, that you've been part of the ongoing effort to recover what was lost. Rest knowing that you matter, that your engagement matters, that you're part of the long story of human memory and transmission. And when you wake, carry that knowledge with you. Let it inform how you think about the past and the future. Let it shape your understanding of your place in the long arc of human story. Let it inspire you to be a good ancestor, a faithful link, a conscious participant in the multigenerational project of cultural preservation and transmission. Because that's what the myths are calling us to be. Not passive recipients of stories, but active participants in the great project they represent. Not just listeners, but also teachers. Not just students of the past, but also servants of the future. The cycle continues. The wheel turns. The giants sleep and wake. The teachers wander. The stories persist. And we, in our moment, in our age, in our brief window of consciousness and agency, have the opportunity to add our link to the chain, to contribute our understanding to the collective project, to be part of the long story of human inquiry and achievement. That opportunity is a gift, and how we respond to it is our gift back, to the ancestors who preserved what they could, to the descendants who will build on what we pass forward, to the great human story itself. So let's respond well. Let's be worthy of the inheritance we've received. Let's be good ancestors to those we'll never meet. Let's be faithful links in the chain that connects all humans across time. Let's listen to the myths. Let's investigate the deep past. Let's preserve what matters. Let's pass forward what we learn. Let's be the people the first people hoped would come. People who would understand, who would remember, who would complete the work they began. Let's wake the sleeping giants, recover the lost knowledge, complete the cycle. Let's remember. That's the simplest and most profound thing we can do. Remember. Take seriously what the myths are trying to tell us. Investigate with open minds and rigorous methods. Look for the patterns, the connections, the evidence of what came before. And then, having remembered, let's pass it forward. Let's be the ones who preserve, who teach, who encode knowledge in durable forms. Let's be the wandering teachers for the next age, the ones who carry the flame through the darkness, the ones who ensure that whatever comes, something survives. That's the lesson of the myths. That's the gift of the first people. That's the responsibility of every generation. And tonight, you've accepted that responsibility. You've engaged with the question. You've listened to the stories. You've been part of the great project. So sleep now, good link in the chain. Sleep, worthy inheritor of ancient wisdom. Sleep, future ancestor to generations yet unborn. Sleep knowing that you've done something meaningful tonight. Something that connects you to the deepest past and the furthest future. Something that matters in the long arc of human story. The myths are grateful for your attention. The first people, across the vast gulf of time, acknowledge your engagement. The sleeping giants stir slightly, sensing that the time of full awakening approaches. And you, in your small but significant way, have helped bring that awakening closer. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this. Now sleep and dream of what was, and what might be recovered, and what we might become when we finally remember fully who we've always been. The world's oldest myth comes from a culture we've never identified because that culture lives in all of us, in our collective memory, in our myths and monuments and deepest cultural instincts. We are the first people's descendants. We are their students. We are their hope. And we are, finally, ready to remember. Good night.